when when I was a pastor, I was wrestling with this idea that we've talked about in class about whether or not God is already at work before any of us ever shows up. The idea that this doctrine of prevenience, of God's grace coming before anything else, that it's really a thing. I was struggling with this, and so I decided to make it my habit to have lunch at the same place every day. It was a local pub, had a huge bar, big restaurant, very popular place in the community. And I decided I was going to have lunch there every Tuesday, and I did that for several years. And my goal was to get acquainted with people, learn how to pray for people, and watch for what was going on. That was what I planned to do. That's what I prayed for. And and as I got acquainted with the people who worked there, as well as with some of the regulars who were daily fixtures at the bar, very gradually I began to be invited into conversations that people wanted to have about life and faith and relationships and all kinds of important questions. And it was interesting. And after a while, when people got to know me and trusted me, it was like a little sign would fall out of the ceiling when I came and sat at my table that said, "The pastor is in." Well, I tried to listen as deeply as I could. I didn't always succeed, but I attempted to discern the voice of God while hearing the deep longings of the people who had come to trust me. And over time, I officiated at a wedding of one of the waitresses. I led a backyard dedication ceremony for a couple who were employees of the pub who had gotten married, had a baby. Had a number of offsite coffee and lunch and even dinner conversations with these people who had become my friends. And one particular exchange really stands out for me. I came to my regular table one day just before the lunch crowd arrived. I'd show up around 11:30, so there wasn't a big mob there, and get a chance to talk to people. This was my custom. And one of the waitresses I had come to know walked up to my table and just stood there looking down. She was young, in her late 20s, and actually had been in high school with one of my daughters. And but she just stood there. She didn't say a word. She just looked down like she was sad. And I asked her what was going on, and she said, "Well, I had this dream just a few days earlier, and I wanted to talk to you about it." So I said, "Okay, tell me about the dream." Here's what she said. She said, "In my dream, I was in a really tall building. It was an old building, but very, very tall. And I stepped into the elevator at the top floor because I was going to get to the bottom floor and leave. And the door shut." She said, "Now, on the wall of the elevator, there was a clock. And there was somebody standing behind me, but I don't know who that was." She kind of dismissed whoever that was. She said the elevator began to descend, as elevators do. But she said suddenly it lurched and something snapped and it began to free fall. And she realized that the cable had broken. She was going to crash multiple floors down and she was going to die. And she says she was so terrified. And she says, I just woke up yelling, screaming. It scared her so badly. And I'd had a lot of conversations with her. She and another waitress and the bartender had actually come to my home for 3 months, once a week for dinner, and we would talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. So we had really built a bond, and I had talked to them about God quite a bit. So I said to her, "Well, what do you think it means?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "Do you think it could be a God thing?" I said. She said, "Yeah, I think maybe." I said, "Well, let me give it some thought and I'll get back to you." So while I sat at my table having my lunch, I prayed and I thought and I thought, and it came to me. And I got out a piece of paper and I wrote it down, what my thoughts were. And I left it with her. And then I said we could talk when I came back the next week. And here's what I said. I said, an elevator is like a smaller contained part of a building, kind of like how the human heart is within the human body. And I said, I think perhaps the elevator for you symbolizes your heart. That is the very core of who you are as a person. And when you looked at the clock suggests to you that time is going by. Time is going by. And you feel like your life is in free fall. Now, she had been open enough to me about her life that I knew that was not a revelation. I knew her life was in free fall. She was kind of lost and looking for love in all the wrong places, if you know what I mean. Anyway, um, and I said, but the most significant part of your dream is the part that you didn't think mattered. You said that there was somebody standing behind you, but you just didn't know who it was. I'm going to suggest to you that that somebody was God, and that you may think that because of where you are in your life that God has been absent, but he's not. God has been standing right next to you the entire time, even in your worst situation, just waiting for you to turn and see that he's there, ready to embrace you. That's what I wrote, something to that effect. I left her with her. I came back the next week. The scene replayed. She stood at the table, just looked down, didn't say a word. I said the same thing. What's going on? She said, I read your note. She said, I think you're right. Well, that led to other conversations, and I will not go into that part, but there were some redeeming things. I wouldn't say that she had this explosive turn to faith and went off and started an international ministry or anything like that, but but some significant changes did happen, and our paths went separate, so I wasn't able to go to the pub anymore. We did lose contact, but I continue to pray for her. Well, let me tell you about spiritual direction. I'm not a spiritual director. I'm not certified as one. Some of you may be, and you may know something about it. But spiritual direction is a classical Christian practice that may involve only two people. It could involve a small group of people. And in the preface to the book, Spiritual Direction, which is a collection of writings on the subject by the Roman Catholic priest Henry Nouwen, the authors of the book say that Nouwen understood spiritual direction this way. He understood it as, excuse me just a moment here, as a relationship initiated by a spiritual seeker who finds a mature person of faith willing to pray and respond with wisdom and understanding to his or her questions about how to live spiritually in a world of ambiguity and distraction. Along with that, in their book, The Practice of Spiritual Direction, Fathers Barry and Connolly put it this way. They say that we define Christian spiritual direction as help given by one Christian to another, which enables that person to pay attention to God's personal communication to him or her, to respond to this personally communicating God, to grow in intimacy with this God, and to live out the consequences of the relationship. The focus of this type of spiritual direction is on experience, not ideas, and specifically on religious experience, that is, any experience of the mysterious other whom we call God. Now, while certainly Nouwen and Barry and Connolly and others would see spiritual direction as a practice that takes place only among Christians, there are others who allow for spiritual direction with people who might define themselves as seekers. And again, Nouwen does suggest such a thing. And to help such seekers in living lives of depth and authenticity. But what I am suggesting is not a form of spiritual direction that attends to some just ethereal, mystical desires of a directee, but rather that classical spiritual direction offers us a framework for evangelism that allows us to see that work as a kind of sacred space where people come together as co-humans made in the image of God, in which we serve the other as a guide to seeing how God is already at work. We come to the work of evangelism distinctively as followers of Jesus who have come to believe that the gospel, the good news of God's kingdom, is good news for everyone. In his book, Beginning Well, which explores Christian discipleship, Gordon Smith sees spiritual direction as something that's embedded in and included with the work of evangelism. He says, evangelism is essentially encouraging others to respond to the work of the Spirit in their lives. The primary responsibility of the community of faith is to encourage conversation about how God is already at work in our lives. Evangelism then includes spiritual direction, helping others discern and be attentive to the prompting and direction of God, the rhythms of grace in their lives. Rather than telling them what they should do and experience, we walk beside them, asking them what they are experiencing and helping them make sense of what is happening. Dr. Richard Peace, who taught for many years at Fuller Seminary, has been a good friend to me. He uses the term contemplative evangelism to describe spiritual direction as a framework for evangelism. And he says, contemplative evangelism would be evangelism out of the silence rather than by way of the loud proclamation. It would be evangelism of companionship, as both evangelist and seeker reach out to God. It would be evangelism of the retreat and the small group conversation, rather than evangelism of the large meeting and forceful challenge. It would be evangelism of spiritual direction, in which the voice of God is sought, rather than evangelism of the witnessing monologue. Being attentive to others and to God, a practice that is grounded in classical spiritual direction, allows us to be present to the people around us, regardless of their faith convictions. And spiritual direction involves two simultaneous acts of listening to God and listening to the other. Spiritual direction as evangelism is a way of demonstrating that the God of love, the King of the kingdom, is present and at work in the lives of people, whether they know it or not. This work, of course, is not formulaic, it's not scripted, nor is it something that we can master and just sort of roll out like a program anytime that we feel like it. Whether we're talking about evangelism that is expressed through signs and wonders, whether it's expressed through deep listening and conversation, it comes from a life that is continuously attentive to God, a life that is being formed by God's Spirit. This week, as you watch the video of Leah Libresco and her journey to Christian faith, a journey that moves from atheism to Roman Catholicism, note the interplay between how God was revealing himself to her and how her Christian friends were serving as spiritual directors on her behalf. And finally, here are some questions for you to ponder. You don't have to respond to anything on this. I give them to you to give consideration. How are attentiveness to God, attentiveness to others, how are attentiveness, spiritual direction, and signs and wonders related to one another? Taken together, why are they significant? Or perhaps why are they not significant in terms of evangelism? They are just there. Those questions are just there for you to give thought to. But I will say they could form the basis of a very interesting paper.